It amazes me, and I give the credit to the message because I talk about freedom, and I talk about how freedom brings people together and how big government divides us because we're always fighting over a shrinking pie. And yet freedom is not judgmental. Freedom allows people to use their money and their lives and their social life as they see fit. And we're not, telling other people how to live. It doesn't mean that we endorse what other people do. And all of a sudden you look out there, and I'm always reminded to bring this up, because all I have to do is look at the faces down there, and they are so different. I mean, this week I had a young man come into my office today, and he said, up until I heard your little spat with Giuliani on why we have terrorism, he said, I was always a very liberal Democrat. And all of a sudden he says, you open up my eyes. Well, that gives me a lot of encouragement because a lot of young people tell me that.
Tell us quickly a little bit about your background before Congress, before politics. You were born and raised in Pennsylvania.
Right.
At one point in time, you were a track star. Can I call you that? You ran track and broke some records and things. Tell us a little bit more about your growing up.
Well, I was raised in western Pennsylvania near Pittsburgh, and track was my best sport, and I did very well and won a couple events when I was a junior. But then I had a setback because I had some football injuries, and I continued to run but never excelled the way I thought I could have without having an injury. Back then, the surgeries weren't quite as good as they are today. They actually made things worse. Went to Gettysburg College. Late in college, I decided to go to medical school. Went to medical school at Duke. Did some more training up at Henry Ford Hospital. Got drafted during the Cuban crisis. Spent 5 years in the Air Force. Went back and finished up my training and settled in Texas. But during that time, even shortly after I got out of medical school, or even at the end of medical school, I got interested in reading things other than medicine. It seemed to me that my recreation was reading other things, whether it was Atlas Shrugged or Dr. Zhivago or The Road to Serfdom by Hayek. Then I got fascinated and I got introduced to Austrian free market economics.
I want to ask you about that because a lot of people don't know Friedrich Hayek and the Austrian economic theory. How did you first get involved in that? And tell us who he is and what that theory was.
Well, it's called Austrian because the leaders of the Austrian school came from Austria, and they escaped they were mostly Jewish, and they escaped Hitler. And Mises was the leader at the time, and he came over here at the age of 60, didn't know the English language, and wrote his greatest book in English, Human Action, after he got here. So he's sort of a intellectual hero for me. And Hayek was one of his students, and Hayek, why he is better known, The Road to Serfdom is better known, and he won the Nobel Prize. So it had credibility, but it's still 3 or 4% of the economists in the country, and essentially none in Washington. But as far as I'm concerned, it has the answer because it blends together the moral defense of personal liberty and the practical defense of free markets, and the humanitarian approach of caring about personal liberties also provides the economic abundance that we need to take care of people. But it also incorporates into this much of what the founder said and designed in the Constitution, and that is that we shouldn't be telling other people how to live. We're supposed to set a good standard, then other people will want to follow us. So it just all comes together. And the young people said, well, it makes no sense now because they see this bringing together of personal liberty and economic liberty and calling it one thing rather than having some people say, well, I'm going to defend your personal liberties and your freedom of speech, but economically I want to control your life. And all of a sudden this comes together and it's one piece and it's so logical. And people get excited about it when they made this discovery. This is what I've seen, and this is why I've been so energized about the young people rallying to this, and also discovering that there were millions of others who've been sitting back knowing this, but they had nobody to speak out for them, and then they were energized and they came into the campaign.
Now let's talk about the campaign and the candidacy and your message. And one of the last paragraphs, again in the New York Times, was asking the question, but what is Ron's message? Whatever the campaign's purports to be about, the main thing it has done thus far is to serve as a clearinghouse for voters who feel unrepresented by mainstream Republicans and Democrats. The anti-government activists of the right and the anti-war activists of the left have many differences, maybe irreconcilable ones, but you were able to reach both of those constituencies and pull them in. What was that? What is your platform based on, and why?
It's based on the assumption that we all have a right to our life and our liberty. It comes in a natural way. It doesn't come from government. We can call them natural rights or God-given rights. And this is appealing to everybody because it involves property rights too. And whether they come from the left and they belong to the Green Party, all of a sudden they realize that if you really protect property rights, you have no right to pollute anybody's air or water. So it brings people from the left, and those same individuals are more likely to be opposed to the war. At the same time, you go to the conservatives who like economic liberty. But I think we've lived in an age where there's been too much compromise. The Democrats, who are supposed to protect civil liberties and be anti-war, compromise, and they wimp out on that. And the conservatives, we elect them to balance a budget and have economic liberty, and they take care of the drug companies and the insurance companies and the military-industrial complex. And what I do is bring this together that if you defend liberty, you only have to follow the Constitution because it's a darn good document. And all of a sudden, people start coming together. And once they discover that, they get pretty excited.
Oftentimes, your response to questions is to read this document, read the Constitution. And you use that sometimes in responding to what in this document early on in your life told you that this was really the only book that we needed to follow when we're talking about government?
Well, I probably approach things more from a moral viewpoint of what I believe we should have. And then as years went on and I studied more deeply the Founding Fathers and the document, I said, well, you know, fortunately for me, the Constitution defends what I innately believe. There are shortcomings in our Constitution, more so at the beginning than now. But to me, the document is very important, but the rule of law is equally important. So if you are careless, and some are careless coming from the left, what they'll do is they'll say, well, the Second Amendment is not that important, and the Fifth Amendment is not important, Ninth and Tenth, that's old-fashioned. Mm-hmm. And Article 1, Section 8 doesn't matter anymore, that's anachronistic, which I had been told. How can you protect the First Amendment? So it's the idea of whether individuals, for different reasons, can ignore part of the Constitution, there's nothing left. And that's why the agreement between the people and the government is every bit as important as what the agreement says. Fortunately for us as Americans, the document was great. And that's why we had the maximum amount of freedom and the maximum amount of prosperity, all under threat today. Just think of what's happened since 9/11. Personal liberty is under daily attack. Our economic system is collapsing. We don't have sound money. The dollar is weak and continue to go down. And we're in perpetual war. I mean, some of our candidates have said, it won't matter if we have to stay there 100 years. Where are we going to get the troops and the money to do so? The empire is ending. And I want it to end gracefully and not in a calamity, not with runaway inflation, which has happened numerous times over history. Then, if I think personal liberties are under threat now, they'll be much more so if there's chaos, because the emergency powers now laying at the doorstep of any executive branch, anybody, you know, any president now is so overwhelming that they virtually can declare a dictatorship in this country.
Well over a year ago, you looked at our, as you have throughout your entire career and your study and your interest in the economy, and said the dollar is collapsing and will collapse, and that was before a lot of people even took a close look at whether or not we would be able to compete. The money controlled by China, compared to the euro. I mean, you were sort of out front on this, weren't you?
Well, I would think so. Not that I was alone. I mean, all the Austrian economists were out in front, and they've been right. Matter of fact, it was the predictions of the Austrian economists that made these predictions in the 60s. They said this pseudo-gold Bretton Woods gold standard, honoring the dollar at $35 an ounce, it wouldn't work. And on August 15th, 1971, it collapsed. And that's when Bretton Woods broke down and we broke our promises. And that's when I entered politics, because I saw this, the handwriting on the wall, and what it would lead to. And just look at any chart from 1971 on, the growth of government, the growth of spending, the growth of deficit, the devaluation of the dollar continuing, and inflation rates, everything, since there's no link of our currency to anything that is a hard asset. It's only linked to the trust of the politicians who get reelected by promising things. Even on this very day, we just recently had this vote on the budget, and war spending, emergency spending, not even on the budget, avoid the rules, proposed by the president, $100 billion. The Democrats add $40 billion for military spending and adds all this stuff for domestic spending. And nobody cares about the deficit, so there's no concern whatsoever in Washington. At the same time, the markets are screaming and hollering there's something seriously wrong. That's why monetary policy is very, very key. The watching the value of the dollar is the test to watch about where we stand as a nation. And you can get away with it for a long time because the trust factor can last longer than it deserves to be trusted. And we've trusted in the dollar, the world has, but now they're starting to reject the dollar.
Let me throw out some